Thank you for having me. I apologize for slightly changing the title of my talk. I thought like the second part of my talk will fit more in like kind of broader aspect of igneous processes than fluid dynamics. And this research wouldn't be here if it was just me. It's part of collaborative work with Professor Marian Holness from University of Cambridge, Tricia Owen-Smith from University of Johannesburg, and Professor John Wheeler from University of Liverpool, and many more. As Lydia said, my name is Zoja. I am a lecturer at University of East Anglia. I am igneous petrologist, and I hope that every research project I do, I tackle from a field side perspective, from basic microscopy, and then quantitative microanalysis, which would include quantitative textual analysis, but also mineral chemistry. So what is rock microstructure? I'm not going to read this kind of definition of what rock microstructure is, but how I see rock microstructure. For me, it's almost like an architecture of a rock. So if you imagine a house built of bricks, these bricks can be different material, can be different shapes, different sizes. It's the same with the rock. Rock is built of different minerals, sometimes only one mineral, sometimes more than one, up to 10, who knows how many. And they all have different shapes, sizes, their relationship with each other are different. And that all can tell us something about processes, how this rock form. And as I said, I'm mainly interested in igneous rocks and not volcanics, sorry guys, but mostly rocks that cooled and crystallized within the Earth's crust. And every geology student gets actually in touch with the microstructure early on. From when you start looking at a microscope, you're already looking at some type of microstructure. For example, in a volcanic rock, you will immediately identify that you have large crystals and small crystals, and that tells a story where these crystals crystallize. Did they crystallize slowly, somewhere deeper in the magma chamber, or did they crystallize close to the surface? So grain shape and sizes tell us about time, pace, and place of crystallization. If we see a rock that has all these crystals oriented in a single or in a dominant direction, that can also tell us something about this rock. If the crystals are not deformed and they are magmatic, they're likely to be deposited from either convecting magma or flowing magma. The absence of alignment of the crystals can also tell us where this magma cooled. It cooled as it arrived in the magma chamber or on surface, it cooled in situ. So there was no time for shear to act on these crystals to orientate them, but they just cooled as they arrived to their final destination. Shape of the grain boundaries can tell us a lot about the rock. It can tell us how crystalline it was while it was cooling, but it also tells us how long it took to equilibrate. If you think about mantle rocks, we always envision olivine crystals with a kind of almost foam structure where grain boundaries are 120 degrees, because these rocks stay quite a long time at high temperatures, and their shapes reach the perfect energy balance. So they're quite stable shapes. Igneous rocks, shallower rocks, usually do not have these foam structure that easily, or not all of them have this. So if you find something where grain boundaries are getting close to 120 degrees, it again tells you about how long this rock had experienced this kind of equilibration. A lot of rocks are also deformed, and you can easily determine that in the thin sections. The crystals can be bent, they can have undulatory extinction. I'll remind you what that is. So it tells us what happened to this rock after it cooled or during its magmatic history, sometimes even. So I do rely a lot on basic optical petrography, and I hope every geologist relies on a basic optical petrography, but I also use electron backscatter diffraction analysis to quantify my observations. So EBSD can specify how strong a fabric is, so how strong crystals are aligned. We can use it to identify different phases. We can characterize crystallographic orientation of these different phases. We can say how much a crystal is deformed, not just that it's deformed, but for how much. And we can also even look at the shape preferred orientation of these crystals. So EBSD is a scanning electron microscope-based technique. We have additional EBSD detector. The sample is 70 degrees inclined from the electron beam, and the electrons are scattered on the EBSD detector that can then identify crystallographic axis and match it with the theoretical unit matches. And then I was planning to talk about these beautiful samples here, but I don't have time. So here there is a phase map of melanogabbro, let's say, from a still water intrusion in Montana. It's a layered intrusion in Montana. And you can see that there are this is an EBSD map, but it's a phase map, and you can see the three different colors. Blue corresponds to plagioclase, orange to orthopyroxene, and green to clinopyroxene. So we get a nice, similar to SEM maps, nice map of different phases. But we also get the orientation. So this is a plagioclase orientation map, and each crystal is defined, has its own orientation here. So today I'm going to talk about two case studies. One is going to be from specific layering called trough layering in scalar intrusion, and Kunene anorthosite complex from Angola in Africa. So why these two? Well, trough layering, it was a project that I worked with Professor Holness quite some time ago, but it really showed me how elegant and straightforward microstructural work can be. And whereas Kunene anorthosite complex is an ongoing project, which fascinates me and drives my research questions since I started working on it. And the two things that they have one thing that they have in common is plagioclase crystals. So trough layering, you will see, has sets of plagioclase rich layers alternating with the mafic layers. So mafic layers means pyroxene or olivine, so iron and magnesium rich layers, whereas Kunene anorthosite complex is almost entirely made of plagioclase crystals. Why I like plagioclase crystals is because they often preserve their primary shape. Therefore, you can decipher different processes. You can decipher magmatic processes because you know that there is some remnants of magmatic events there. You can still recognize them. And then there is also ample space to identify different different processes that come after. They are triclinic in terms of their symmetry, which sometimes complicates my life, but I'm not going to talk about bad things, only good things today. So first part, we are going to Greenland, very topical or almost very topical, and to scalar layered intrusion. So layered intrusions are these large basaltic, mafic, ultramafic to mafic bodies. So they are like iron and magnesium rich, and they're very, as their name says, they have layers. So, and these layers are result from change in the mineralogy. So you will have, for example, dominant plagioclase rich layer, then you will go to the olivine rich layer, then apatite comes. So we change our model mineralogy, and we see that in the layering. And one of the undying question in our discipline is how these layers form. So I'm not going to go into details at all how they form. There are at least 4 or 5 different processes that they can form, and we all agree in our discipline that there are different processes behind their formation. What we don't agree for example, in Bushville complex, the largest layered intrusion in the world, we all have our own ideas how particular layers form and also when they form. So it's a very friendly, but also kind of heated community in terms of how we discuss our ideas. Why is this all important? Well, it is important is because layered intrusion hosts ore minerals, such as platinum group elements, such as titanium, vanadium, and sometimes even rare earth elements. So it's not only to trigger our imagination to understand how these magmatic body cool and form, but we also know if we understand how they form, we might improve our understanding how we have concentration of these metals within these layers. So back to Skarsgård intrusion. It is around 50 million years old intrusion, and it's divided in a couple of zones here. It's from hidden zone, lower zone, main zone, and upper zone. But these particular interesting layers are called trough layers. So you can see them, they're almost synclinal layers. And you can find them here in the upper zone A. So they're these like troughs lying on top of homogeneous gabbros. These trough layerings are present along this peninsula. There are a couple of them, almost 15 or something, 17, maybe more. And they look here. You have here Madeleine Humphreys from Durham and Olivier Namour who is now in Belgium in 2011, I think, expedition that I went first time to collect these rocks. So they're quite impressive, and they also have some almost sedimentary features of cross-bedding within these layers. So it's almost like you would think it's almost like a perfect way to study sedimentation processes within magmas. Because crystals do behave like pebbles sometimes. When you have a moving magma, they will behave similar to pebbles in the river. So how does this all start? Back in 2017, Marian Hollis and I were trying to figure out how much viscous compaction is prevalent in layered series, so outside this trough zone. And we found it interesting that the formation microstructure is not so prominent. You have some bending of the crystals, but imagine if you would compress something to extract the late melt, you would imagine that you would bend your crystals, that you might even dissolve some of the crystals in order to accommodate this compaction. However, we didn't find that much strong arguments for compaction. And then we thought, well, wait a minute, this trough layer, the trough bends or trough layering were also explained by compaction. So let's look at them. So in this paper in particular, because it's a unique, it's not very common to see such kind of layers in layered intrusions. Those authors describe these as a result of compaction. So we wanted to double check that, well, to test. And if you look at the thin sections of these trough layers, they again do not look much deformed. And in the field, you see these large plagioclase, not large, long plagioclase crystals almost aligning in one direction, in a kind of this direction. And Marian was looking at some different drill cores around Skarsgård, and what she figured out that in this middle zone, upper zone A, there is a big peak in aspect ratio, so how long a crystal is elongated in this area that corresponds with the presence of these trough layerings. So that was kind of interesting. So what we did, we looked at the samples. So we currently are trying to revisit this study, and we have a lot of samples within the trough layers and outside in the homogeneous gabbro. So here is a trough layer, here is a homogeneous gabbro on the side. So in the trough layers, here you maybe do not yet have the feeling how strong the fabric is, but the fabric is there. What is interesting here that we have some smaller crystals here and aligned crystals. In a homogeneous gabbro, we initially thought it's going to be way less aligned, but it does show fabric, and I'll show you in a second how much. This is a aspect ratio map. So these are EBSD maps, and we color coded them in respect to their aspect ratio. So the dark crystals are those that are very much aligned, and the short crystals are those, and the light crystals are those that are kind of stubby and short. And there is actually, when you see in this 2D section, quite a lot of these stubby crystals. Whereas here, not so much. Here, it seems that the 2D section cuts through relatively elongated crystals. But if we look at the pole, so these are pole figures. These are three main axes and planes. So this is 1, 0, 0 axis, these three. And these are poles to plane 0, 1, 0 and 0, 0, 3. 0, 0, 1, sorry. And what is interesting is that even in a homogeneous gabbro, though it's much weaker fabric, and we have different indices to show that. So the foliation, here we have a clear foliation. So this girdle implies foliation, but these point maxima also say, oh, there is also some lineation. Lineation means all your crystals are looking at you, they're all aligned in the same direction, whereas foliation is those that they're forming a planar surface, or a plane. So, but the point is here that actually in the trough layers, the lineation is much, much stronger. The whole fabric is much stronger, and the lineation is stronger. You can see all these point maximas are focusing in kind of a point concentrations, whereas here it's much more messier, though there is a little bit of point maximum. So these crystals that are short in 2D, so that are not short, but low aspect ratio, but also kind of equant, are actually those crystals looking at you as the thin section is cut. So thin sections are cut perpendicular to the layering. So crystals, these plagioclase crystals, are looking at you, and they are parallel to the axis of the troughs. So we said, like, if we would have compaction, we would also assume that some crystals are deformed. And I did say that they are a little bit deformed. So now here, this is from trough bent. I'll show you where the sample is coming from. It's from here, and it cross-cuts plagioclase rich layer and olivine-rich layer, or mafic layer. And you can, so this is the olivine-rich part, this is plagioclase-rich part, and these two maps here represent the amount of distortion within the crystal lattice compared to its average orientation. So how much it deviates from non-deformed grain, let's say. And you can see that olivine is almost non-deformed at all. There is a little bit of plasticity, and plagioclase is very similar. So only occasional grain is, a couple of grains are deformed. So it's not, if maybe that was a compaction, but it's not a dominant process that formed these features. So we have a strong fabric, both lineated and foliated. We have plagioclase axis parallel to the flow direction, and we do not have significant intragrain deformation. So instead of these layers forming as a result of compaction, we agreed with Irwin et al., who first proposed that actually what happened is that we had a collapse of the wall of the magma chamber, and kind of triggering this crystal-laden magma current that flows towards the main and upper zone. So I always thought that if only people would look more carefully into their thin sections, they would be, though EBSD was not there, well, it was in 1997, but it was still early on. But still, like, some things can be even seen without EBSD. So the second part, I'm taking you to Africa, in Angola. I'm going to talk about anorthosites. Through my study of layered intrusions, I really kind of became almost obsessed with anorthosites. So in particular now, massive type anorthosites. So these are, so layered intrusion often would have a section that's dominated by these rocks, but this rock, these anorthosites also exist on its own. So just a large, very, very large bodies of these rocks without any kind of concept of layered intrusions around them. So, and you can see here where they are. There we have some in Norway, in Finland. I think Lofton is in Finland, or in, anyways, North Scandinavia. The whole Granville province in Canada, in eastern Canada, is also famous for its anorthosite occurrence. And here is our Kunene complex. So why are they so interesting? Well, they carry deposits. They are associated to, well, they do not carry their own deposits, but they're always associated, or in 70% of anorthosites that we have on Earth, they are associated to titanium, vanadium, and rare earth deposits. And they also cover most of the surface of the moon. So moon is made of mare basalts and anorthosites. So it's also, by understanding how these bodies form, we also understand early planetary formation and differentiation. But what I like a lot about the anorthosite problem is what Bowen said in 1917. The beauty is it in simplicity. It's only made on almost entirely of only plagioclase. But that's also the problem. We do not understand it because it's so almost monomineralic. So how did it form? And what we know about it is that 80% more or less is made of plagioclase. We have, next to plagioclase, we have mafic minerals, so olivine and pyroxenes, and iron titanium oxides. The composition is around, plagioclase composition is intermediate. Another interesting part about these rocks, they only occur during Proterozoic time. So from 2.7 billion years to 0.5 billion years. We do not have anorthosites on Earth on its own after that time. We know that they had polybaric crystallization, so they crystallize along the range of different pressures. What we debate about these rocks is, how did we get these anorthosites? What is the primary magma of this? It's not anorthositic magma. They crystallize from basaltic magmas, but we also don't know how much, well, we argue how much component is mantle and how much component is crustal. We also argue about how they're emplaced in the crust. And the most mainstream model is that they place like a diapirs. Plagioclase is very light mineral. It has very low density, so it's a buoyant, and my colleagues imagine that they rise as a big blobs of magma to their final destination. We do not know why they are necessarily, well, or we debate why they are. They occur only during Proterozoic time, and we also argue which type of geodynamical settings they occur. So this is kind of to just sketch different models. So one model is that they form in extensional environments when we have a rise of these diapirs. Then we have another that diapir migrate along the lineaments, along the weaknesses in the crust, or that actually there is a feeder dike feeding a higher up magma chamber with this anorthositic melt. I'm not going to argue too much today about this, but it is a very interesting problem that we still are not completely understanding. If you talk about granites, people do not believe that granites rises as diapirs anymore, but with anorthosites, it's not that black and white. So this is my South African headquarters. Without them, I would have never worked on these rocks. So this is Trish, Grant, and Jeremy. They come from University of Johannesburg and University of Witwatersrand. And their students, I apologize, I don't know their name. So a Kunene anorthosite complex is huge. It's on the same land scale like Bushveld in South Africa. So this is around more than 200 kilometers wide and long, and it emplaced over around 30 million years, I think. I think that this one's emplaced first, then this one second, and then the central part is the youngest. Anorthosites from Angola look quite interesting. We think about these diapirs are very massive textures, so absence of strong fabric, but we still see here, I hope I can convince you that there is some type of layering present in these rocks, or at least some type of concentration of mafic minerals that's not that's different than this white plagioclase dominant mass. And here are the mafics, they're interstitial, and initially, until we didn't come here, they were assumed that they are not deformed, that plagioclase is deformed, but the mafics were not deformed. And you can see actually there is quite significant plagioclase deformation. And like granites, there are these little we call them dikelets of finer anorthosite dikes intruding the main anorthosite. So let's call it the anorthosite magma chamber is quite dynamic. There is a lot of things going on. It's not just a blob of, as I said, blob of massive randomly oriented plagioclase. It's much more dynamic, and hopefully in future we will understand more these processes within these large bodies. But if we look now at my favorite thin sections, there are more or less three main types that we identified. There are foliated anorthosites with no mafics. Then there are foliated anorthosites where olivine and pyroxenes are present. And you can see how, if this is foliation, you can see that the mafics are parallel to the foliation planes given by plagioclase. And then this, if I remember the name, so in anorthosite literature, this particular texture is called, I forgot. I knew I'm going to forget it. But anyway, they have a specific terminology for this particular texture, which you wouldn't find in the normal, well, in a kind of mainstream petrology literature. When we have these large plagioclase crystals and then very strong grain reduction along their boundaries. So this is just the phase maps made by EBSD, and I just wanted to point out this one. This is this dikelet I showed. It has quite different texture. There is no foliation here, or very weak if there is even. And spoiler alert, it's also deformed in a very similar way, like these rocks here. So just to remind you, for those who are maybe not that much into petrography, and especially deformation microstructure. So I'm going to talk a lot about subgrade boundaries and a lot, another 15 minutes, slip systems. So, and they occur along subgrade boundaries. So what are subgrade boundaries? We have, you might have heard about undulatory extinction in quartz. This looks something like this. When you turn your microscope table, the quartz extinct in a kind of wavy way. And this is because dislocations within that quartz are distributed all around the crystal. But as you start to kind of recover your rock from the strain, these dislocations are arranged in arrays, either deformation bands or finally subgrain boundaries. And we can define these subgrain boundaries as tilt boundary or twist boundary. And I'm not going to go too much into detail. With EBSD, we can relatively easily determine to characterize tilt boundary, where twist boundary is much more difficult to determine, and I'm not going to go into that at the moment. But I want to just tell you that there are three different kind of information we need to know to determine the slip system. Is slip plane, what is the slip plane that the crystal kind of slipped, the slip direction, so what direction it slipped or bent, and the rotation axis along which the slip occurred. And this is now plagioclase, anorthosite, and also plagioclase rich, basically anorthosite with no mafics. And here we have a colorful map that shows us how much these grains are deformed. So these are like, for example, these single grains. You can see there is kind of like this change in color here. Here it goes up to yellow, which is around 10 degrees. But you also have these tiny little grains that are dark blue, which means these are recrystallized, completely strain-free grains. We are not at this point interested in those little grains. We are interested in these large grains that are deformed. And John Wheeler kindly gave us a quote that we can analyze very precisely the slip direction that occurs within this grain. It's called weighted Burgess vector. And we identified that in these deformed grains, dominant Burgess vector is 0, 0, 1, because we have the biggest cluster in most of these low angle boundaries are red here, and that fits, trust me, 0, 0, 1 direction. And in the anorthosite that contains mafics, it corresponds the same. The most dominant Burgess vector is 0, 0, 1, so slip direction is 0, 0, 1. But we also found a dominant slip system that we do not, well, sorry, not dominant, but additional slip, did I tell you correctly? Yeah, additional slip direction which hasn't been reported before. That's not now something very wow. It just tells you people do not look enough in the microstructure in different rocks. So we still do not know everything about how these crystals are deforming. Yeah, this is 0, 1, 0 Burgess vector, which is quite weird. So olivine is a magical crystal if you ask people who are working in mantle, because if you characterize their slip systems, you can tell something about different conditions of deformation. So our olivine in these anorthosites that contain mafics is quite deformed, which previously wasn't an option. It was considered undeformed. You can see here a lot of low angle boundaries, these red lines, and we characterize these slip directions to be 1, 0, 0. Misorientation axis is 0, 1, 0. And I know that this is hard to follow, and I apologize, but soon a fun part is coming. So when we know all these axes that are quite confusing, and they confuse me as well, we can determine which slip system operated in olivine. And while some people will be more skeptical, combining that information with additional data could maybe be more persuasive to people who are skeptics. However, in these olivine crystals, we have two dominant slip systems. We have an E and A. What is special about A is very common slip system. It occurs in most crustal rocks, but the E indicates that it has higher water contact within the crystal lattice. The anorthosites are very, very dry rocks, but it tells us that something was actually, there was water in a system that make this crystal deform differently than just dry olivine from the crustal situations, for example, which is quite interesting. So plagioclase is not as elegant as olivine in terms of what can their slip system tell us, but it does tell, like, these slip systems do occur over a wide range of temperatures. And considering that olivine is deformed, these rocks were almost solid when they were deformed, because there is not many other interstitial phase present in this rock. If we had interstitial, like kind of evolved liquid, it was gone by the time that the formation occurred. So what do we think about this E-type slip system in olivine? Well, these people worked, Carato and Alt, they worked a lot on deformation experiments and changing these conditions to deform their olivine crystals. And what they, again, as before, said that these E and C type are occur in mantle, so it should be very high temperature, but also sometimes can be related to the mantle wedge. If your olivine is deformed by these slip systems, it kind of fits into the mantle wedge deformation as well. This by itself is not very deterministic, right? Because it can be this and it can be this and it can be all different things. But another interesting study on different type of anorthosite actually showed that there are some boron isotopes in these dry rocks that could be indicative of slab lithologies. So Trish's students now are analyzing different light isotopes in this rock to see if it's possible, because so my colleagues already kind of hinted that it could be very kind of broad term slab tectonics involved here, but they didn't have proofs. So this could be one of the proofs that actually it was not just extensional regime, but it was more complicated than that. So to summarize, I'm a bit I hurried a bit, but then we will have more time for questions. So to summarize this part, so the anorthosites by themselves are quite complicated. They do not only seem as these massive blobs that magically arise and placed into the crust. They show layering. They show even when there is no layering, they show alignment of crystals, but they also show absence of layering and alignment of crystals. So they also show these late diplets coming in. So it's a very dynamic anorthosite magma chamber, if I can say so. We also observed that at least in Kunene, everything is deformed, including these late diplets. We know that this deformation was interpreted as emplacement deformation. So there was no major tectonic event that deformed these rocks. So, and the modelers assume that this diapir esplanade does occur in a kind of rheologically solid diapirs, but we never actually show that in the rocks. So it does fit into this rheological solid diapirs, but we still need to investigate more, and especially going to the field and collecting these rocks. It does seem that the temperature of the formation was quite high, and that there might be some suggestion that water was present in the system. So is that an arc setting? We need to learn more, but it is an exciting start. So I hope that I convinced you that rock microstructures can represent a smoking gun. So if we completely ignore rock microstructure, we can drive our observations in the models that we want, well, that we think that other data is leading us, but the microstructure might hide actually a route to reconsider your models. Maybe it will fit to your model, but maybe it also doesn't fit. So if one thing doesn't fit, you need to readjust something.